Good morning and welcome to the new edition of Dr. Lamba's Awakening Call. Just a few days back, the Liberal federal government placed the economic statement in the House of Commons. And I'm amazed that the media and the people took no notice of it. The economic statement is a sheer gamble. Of course, you can call it a daring fiscal bet, but reality is there is just a gamble with the economy of the country. Is the largest single year. 1 year, it never has happened that in 1 year the budgetary deficit is so high. It was in 1966-67 that Canada started the practice of keeping a record of its budgetary allocations, surpluses, and deficits. And this year, one single year, the deficit is 381.6 billion. Imagination staggers that for a population of 37 million, the annual deficit should be almost 400 billion. And can you believe it? It is greater than the total federal spending in the previous fiscal year. So the deficit alone exceeds the total spending, and the total spending was 375 billion last year, which included 21.77 billion deficit. So the real spending was 350 billion only. And now the deficit is almost 400 billion. Shocking. Are you not shocked? Do you not perceive how much the public debt would be? Do you not understand how much your children and the grandchildren would have to pay for the inane and absolutely wool gathering actions of the present government? And the Canadians are told that such aggressive debt expansion is sustainable. But the government is quite cunning. After all, they employ shrewd economists and copywriters. They add a caveat. Well, it is readily sustainable provided, and there is the sting is in the tail, provided GDP growth exceeds the interest rate and debt servicing charges remain low. Now, both the things are not going to happen. GDP growth is very, very minimal in this country. When it is 1% and 2%, we go gaga on that. And debt servicing charges cannot remain low when the public debt is so high. So this is caveat that the government has is only to lull you to sleep, and it has absolutely no validity. You can be sure that upward pressure is for the interest rates. The Bank of Canada wants it, the economists recommend it, but the government would not have it that way. According to them, we should have a sustainable growth, especially aggressive debt expansion should be sustainable. Post COVID-19, we have seen short term GDP growth in the countries with sounder economic policies than Canada has, could surpass normal GDP growth in Canada. That's a fact. So, what is the result? The inflation would force Bank of Canada to wind down its holding of the federal debt. And when it winds down, the effect on the economy and the economic health of the country shall be a disaster. Even before COVID 19, the fundamentals of Canadian economy were weak, and the current account deficit has been there for 11 running years. For 11 years, we are having a deficit, and demographic growth is actually masking the sluggish economic growth. We confuse the two, and the result is that we are becoming economically a house of cards, which at one whiff of wind can come tumbling down, and all the Jacks and Jills would break their heads and necks. The Global Credit Rating Agency has shamed Canada by lowering its credit rating, and the words used while downgrading the national credit rating are deterioration of Canada's public finances. So it's a governmental policies, it's the public finances which are primarily and essentially responsible for downgrading Canadian national credit rating. What an honor for Canadians that their national credibility has been suspect and now certified not believable. Now, if this was by itself a standalone practice, I might not be worried. But it's not so. The risk is that the growth would continue to lag and it would become worse. Don't be amazed. It will become worse because of an aging population, people like me. And coupled with that aging population, we have regulatory burdens that suffocate investment, sap productivity, and hinder exports. And these three are the base of an economic growth. The government unveiled this deficit of almost $400 billion in its fiscal update, along with spending plans for the more pandemic relief and a stimulus plan to jolt the economy after the pandemic. When the pandemic ends, nobody knows. But the fact that the spending plans are there, this is going to be a disaster definitely, because the spending is there, the sources of income are being sapped, they are being destroyed, as I talked about the investment being decreased, productivity being lowered and reduced, and exports being reduced appreciably. So the basically when I saw this economic statement, I had a shock. And I know people like me, they immediately had a flashback to the 70s. Till 1972, Canadian debt was comparatively low and manageable. But Pierre Elliott Trudeau, the father of the Prime Minister, had the same attitude, same approach of destroying the economy as this Prime Minister has. And when his government ended into a minority government, they made a strategic decision. It was to start spending, give people money, buy them, give more in charities and non governmental organizations. so that the people are obliged and they come back in majority in 1974. The result of this useless parasitic spending in 2 years enabled the national debt to grow. And do you know how much it was? 18% of the GDP was our national debt during Trudeau Sr.'s time. Can you believe it? And then, interest on that continued to compound the accrued debt. Result that the government resources wanted to stimulate in 1990s recession. So, Christian government took power in 93 and they, though liberal, were forced to reduce spending to fight the national debt. That enforcement might have been good if the debt had not been so high. But and it was not a time of recession, but it was a time of recession. And this reduced spending worsened the economic situation. Really, sometimes I feel that the liberals are too liberals with the people's money. It took more than a generation to pay for senior Trudeau's large heartedness in wasting money. And it continued under Jane Chrétien, Paul Morton, and Stephen Harper when the federal spending averaged 13% of GDP. It used to be 18%, so Harper could reduce it to 13% of the GDP. And then from 13%, Trudeau again increased to 15% of the GDP. And now is projected at 19% of the GDP. Almost 50% more. And the question arises, why? Today, if you read the balance sheet of the federal government, you would find a debt of $1 trillion, rather more than that. The federal debt to GDP ratio is unprecedented high. It was 31% in 2019, last year. It is 50.7%, that's almost 51%. So from 31% to 51% is the increase in your debt GDP ratio. Imagine if this was your household and the debt income ratio had risen by 20% in 1 year. You would be thinking of committing suicide. Yes, the government is committing suicide as far as the nation is concerned. And now is forecast that with the new plans, the debt GDP ratio would be 66%, back to what it was under Chrétien. So whatever action Harper had taken to check the debt, to reduce the debt GDP ratio, have been thrown to the winds. Hard political decisions have to be taken. And they can be harmful at times to the government, but they are good for the country. But some prime ministers take view the other way around. They take actions which may be bad for the country but are good for them. The present Liberal government, by contrast, has enabled the debt to grow and it is tending upward. But then it's not something new. Today they blame pandemic, but it was growing up even before the pandemic set in. Along with the government announcement of 100 billion in additional pandemic spending, that debt GDP ratio, as I said earlier, which is already 51%, from 31% to 51% in 1 year, they are thinking of making it 64%. Sorry, 66%. Do I cry for the country and the people of the country? Well, it is something of a shock. I'm in a state of being stunned. And the Canada's deficit growth is comparatively larger than any other G20 countries. Can you believe it? That 20 countries which are supposed to be economically advanced and Canada's deficit growth is larger, deficit growth, not the real growth, going down the drain is larger than any other country. And what does IMF say about it? IMF estimates that the Canada would continue to outpace all other G20 countries in having more and more deficit. What an achievement! I'm sure the government advertisements would be IMF says that in Canada would outpace other G20 countries. Dot dot dot. Because those dollars would signify in deficit spending. So when Minister Freeland speaks with Rosemary Barton, how the government will provide financial support, I'm amazed. If the cost of the pandemic are viewed not in terms of health, but through intergenerational lens, the burden is falling not on my generation, but on the younger generation. They lose out most as their education and entry into the job market are affected. They are disproportionately represented today in the services, and their jobs are being lost. And they'll be responsible for paying the debts that we are incurring without thinking. Older Canadians have fared comparatively better, at least those who have accumulated financial assets. As the stock market returns have been high, and that's thanks not to the Canadian government, but to the international economy. There's a call for surtax to pay for all that is growing, an extraordinary measure, which normally should not be adopted, but I can tell you, Trudeau government will adopt it. And they'll take the plea of socialist pattern that the people in the higher income group shall pay this surtax. But which tax measures are efficient and capable to address the temporary pandemic without risking of becoming permanent? Income tax was it's supposed to be a temporary measure during the World War, but it has become a permanent lodestone around the neck of the people. You remember reunification in 1990 of the Germany. West Germany invested 1 trillion euros of public funds in the former East Germany. And with public finance under duress, Helmut Kohl government struck a grand bargain to pay for investment in surtax solely. Conceived in 1991 as a temporary tax, it has become permanent, and it was now 7.5%. Instead of 1.75%, it ultimately came to 7.5%, and it is payable on personal and business incomes. And now they have realized the stupidity and are phasing it out. Canada needs to do like that. It has to reduce taxation. This enchantment of the government with more taxation is self-defeating. The government should be investing in modest structural deficit. Why? Because that will enhance productive capacity while self-isolating the extraordinary pandemic expenses. Canadians are very, very gentle people. They can be persuaded to pay higher taxes under the false plea that it will free up the fiscal capacity to weather the next storm. And by the next storm, they'll forget all the promises and there'll be further surtax. So, in a tight fiscal environment, this would mitigate the otherwise spending and also tempting use of 2.63 billion annually in carbon revenue tax. Carbon tax is going to be increased so that driving, heating might become beyond the capacity of the normal Canadian. So this is a patchwork in the federal-state relationship. And the carbon tax in the federal backdrop carbon tax, you can see the provinces using some other avenue to pay their own pandemic expenses. This is a bleak picture, a dark picture. But the reality, we have to wait till spring. When the real budget is presented, this economic statement, how it's translated into real budget, is $1 million question. We have to see the Liberal government's post-pandemic agenda. They have not given it as yet. A new Liberal climate plan, for instance, could come in the next few days. And the next agenda might be defined by Liberal priorities to another promise of a national child care scheme. It will depend a lot how far the Canadians will be able to bear the burden of this unimaginative, calculated affront to the problems that Canada is facing. But it's a shock that the authorities that be do not care about what the future generations are going to suffer. And they are just concerned with the immediate present. And that's a tragedy. Think about it. Thank you.